It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for sticking around. It's always great to be the last speaker, particularly when you're up against, as counsel back there knows, Texas OU game. I'm going to talk about mild traumatic brain injury. We've heard earlier speakers today talk about brain injury and severe brain injury, moderate brain injury, and mild traumatic brain injury. So I'm going to talk about brain injury for a while and then discuss what is mild traumatic brain injury. And it's rather difficult to understand mild traumatic brain injury without knowing some basics of the anatomy of the brain. So I'd like to start with some basic, those are the topics we're going to be covering. Pediatric traumatic brain injury towards the end. There are some differences, of course, in a pediatric trauma circumstance. Some brain facts. The brain weighs only about 3 pounds, which is 2% of the average body weight. 20% of your blood goes straight to your heart, from your heart to your brain, because your brain consumes 20% of the body's energy, which is a great deal for one organ. Your brain reaches its full size at about age 6. It doesn't reach full maturity at age 6 because of the neuronal connections that continue to go on as you mature, but your brain size is pretty much at age 6 what it will be for the rest of your life. Important to know about the brain is that it is very fragile. It has the consistency of gelatin. It is not firm. It is very soft. It's very pliable. It's important in understanding mild traumatic brain injury. And lastly, it's highly vascular, meaning it has a great deal of arteries and veins and capillaries throughout the brain, necessary to bring the oxygen, the blood oxygen to the brain. It's an extensively vascular organ, save and except perhaps the liver and the kidneys. It is the most vascular organ in the body, and has to be. But that plays a role in mild traumatic brain injury as well, of all types of brain injury. I just mentioned the extensive arteries and veins. It's a little blurry there, but just know that they are vast. If you took out all of the blood vessels in the brain and you lined them up, they would stretch 60,000 miles, enough to encircle the earth more than twice. That's how vascular your brain is. Your brain also floats inside your skull. It is encased in cerebral spinal fluid, marked here, which covers the entire brain and extends down the spinal cord. Cerebral spinal fluid serves as a shock absorber to the delicate brain. It also circulates nutrients and clears waste from the brain. The brain has waste products just like every other organ in the body. And so cerebral spinal fluid is formed in the ventricles of the brain, which is right here, and is a necessary agent for shock absorber, but also nutrients and waste. But your brain is literally floating inside your skull. Why is that important? When we look at the inner skull surface, you can begin to appreciate how traumatic brain injury occurs when there's rapid acceleration and deceleration forces applied. Your inner skull is far different from your outer skull. Your outer skull, as you know, is very smooth and soft. Your inner skull is not that at all. You can see here this inner skull and these bony ridges and protrusions that protrude out from the surface of the inner skull. And again, remember, your brain is very soft, it's very pliable, and it's suspended in cerebral spinal fluid. So when there are acceleration, deceleration forces that are applied in a traumatic event, the inside of your skull is what your brain is running up against, back and forth. Not a smooth surface, a hard surface, and it's bony and it's rigid, and it does not expand. Your brain is encased inside a bony, rigid skull that does not expand. So when the brain swells, there's no place for it to go. Inside your brain, as we know from prior discussions, and you probably general knowledge, is a vast network of neurons, interconnected, delicate, high-speed communication highway. What is a neuron? Well, let's talk about some basic facts and how many you have. You've got 100 billion neurons in the brain, and they're all microscopic in size. You cannot see them save and except with a microscope. They form, they connect. That network you just saw forms 1,000 trillion neurons in your brain. How many is 1,000 trillion connections of neurons? 1,000 times the number of the stars in the Milky Way. A typical neuron communicates with 1,000 to 10,000 other neurons. And if you were to take the neurons in your brain that you cannot see because they're microscopic in size, and you were to line them up, they would stretch 600 miles long. And that line would be invisible, again, because they're microscopic in size. And if you were to count your neurons, 1 second per neuron, it would take you over 3,100 years. That's how many 1 billion neurons is. Here's the basic anatomy of a brain neuron. It has 3 basic component parts. You've got the cell nucleus, you've got an axon terminal, and you've got dendrites. Now, what are these? The cell nucleus here, called the soma, is where impulses come into a brain neuron from these connecting dendrites, and they are processed. It's a very simplistic term for what happens inside a cell body, but that's where they begin to be processed, these impulses. And I'm talking about electrical impulses, and we'll discuss that further. They are processed here with neurotransmitters and other things of molecule size, and then the electrical charge comes down the axon of a neuron, and off it goes where? To other neurons that it's connected to, that 1,000 trillion connections we spoke of. These impulses that are electrical in nature are called action potentials, and again, they travel down and exit on to the next neuron, the next neuron, the next neuron, that are all interconnected. That's what a thought process is. That's what a memory that's being encoded is. It is an action potential through neuron to neuron to neuron connection. There are 3 basic types. I mentioned the dendrites. Those are the connections that form to other neurons. There are 3 basic types of brain neuron cells. You have sensory, motor, and inner. Sensory brain cells are what we utilize to see things, smell things, hear things. There are specific nerve channels in the brain that are involved in sensory perception. Different type of brain neuron. You have motor brain neurons that control, as you might imagine, motion and function. And then you have inner brain neurons that are connected to other neurons for various reasons and various purposes. I want to talk a little bit more about a brain neuron function because it's important to understand how it functions to then later understand what trauma does to it and how an injury occurs. Again, it is electrical impulse. I show you here again another neuron. There's that nucleus, that's the soma. And then here is the axon. And by the way, axons can vary in length. They are millimeters in some places in the brain. They are actually as long as 3 feet in other parts of the body. That axon that comes out of the spinal cord and goes to your toe is about a meter long, about 3 feet. So some nerves are quite long in length, and again, they are microscopic, and that's important to understand when it comes to litigating these issues, which I do I've done for years on behalf of a number of clients. So back to the electrical nature of a neuron, it fires 5 to 50 times every second to perform whatever function that neuron is designed to perform. But in addition to electrical communication involved, there is a chemical aspect of a firing of a neuron. And that chemical reaction is made possible by what's called neurotransmitters. They are chemical messengers that are stored inside the nucleus and present throughout the axon and exiting terminals. Neuroscience has identified about 100 neurotransmitters so far. They're all molecule size, of course. One of the most prominent, in fact, the most prominent neurotransmitter that aids in the communication process is glutamate. It's an amino acid. Glutamate is, you've We're all familiar with glutamate, I suppose, MSG, monosodium glutamate. Glutamate is an essential element within the human brain, but it has to be in limited quantities. Glutamate, like any other excitatory neurotransmitter, in excess quantity can be highly destructive to the human brain. And I'll mention the significance of that and the further significance of that in just a moment. Neurotransmission, again, it is an electrical chemical process. It is within this place, this space right here, that's called the synaptic cleft. There's an image of it in just a moment, where these neurons, these dendrites of a given axon connect to another axon. That is actually a space in between the connecting neurons. So the word connection is a bit of a misnomer because they don't actually connect. Here's a better image of that. That's a synaptic cleft, obviously an illustration of one. And I mentioned the neurotransmitters, which are chemicals. They pass from neuron to neuron, and it's in that space where these metabolic reactions occur. And that's where glutamate and other neurotransmitters exit, bind with receptors on the adjacent neuron, and create the communication process and the electricity, the electrical action potential goes from one neuron to another within the synaptic cleft. How small is that? It is 50 times thinner than a piece of paper. And you've got billions of these quote-unquote connections within your brain. That's what makes the brain function. That's what makes you think. That's how you encode memories. That's how you retrieve memories. That's how you move. That's how you perceive the world. It is through these connections that everything that is human occurs. I want to pause for just a moment because we've talked about these neurons, and I want to shift gears and explain. I'm going to go back one slide here. That's the head of the neuron here. We've talked about that, and this is important in understanding mild traumatic brain injury. That is gray in nature. Do you see the axon terminal, this that comes down? That is white in nature because they are myelinated. That is myelin cells that form an insulation along this axonal terminal. That creates the effect of that being white, that being gray. Why is that important? Because you may be familiar with the gray and white matter of the brain. Well, here's what that is. The cortex of the brain, this, is gray. That's the gray matter. And the white matter consists of the axons coming out of the nucleus. All right? This is important to understand because there's a juncture here between gray matter and white matter that becomes very important when traumatic brain injury occurs. These are of different densities. Gray matter is more dense than white matter. When things are accelerated and decelerated rapidly, things of different densities travel at different speeds. That'll be important in just a moment when it comes to traumatic brain injury. I want to repeat that. Gray matter is more dense than white matter. Gray matter is made up of the head, the cell body of the neuron. The white matter is the axon coming down with the insulation of myelin on it. And at that juncture where the gray and white matter exist in this slide is significant when it comes to brain injury. Here's another image of it. This is actually a human brain, a side view. And you can again see the gray matter, which is the cortex. That's the neuron head. And these are the axons coming out of it. It's a little misleading to realize that you see these folds are called sulcus and gyrus. Those folds are all gray matter. If you were to unfold the brain, the gray matter would be about the size of a small umbrella. So there is 40% gray matter. It doesn't look like it because they're all folded and layered in there. Again, that's the heads. That's the head of the neuron, the brain neuron. The cell body and the white are the axons. 60% of your brain is made up of white matter, which are axons. Now that you understand and have mastered brain anatomy, Let's talk about what happens to the brain when a traumatic event occurs. Whether it's severe brain injury as a result, moderate or mild, these are the basic functions that occur in the brain that leads to an injury. These examples exclude something like a projectile type injury, a bullet or a metal object of some sort. These really don't apply, but this is what happens when there is significant acceleration, deceleration forces applied to the brain. Let's look at it. What happens? That floating brain that we talked about, collides with the bony inner skull that we've seen images of. When that happens, that soft, gelatin-like brain has bruising and at the point of contact within the inner skull. That's considered a primary injury. At that same time, those delicate neurons that we talked about twist, tear, and break throughout the brain in a widespread way. And that is what's called diffuse axonal injury, and that's a primary injury as well. What is a primary injury versus, say, a secondary injury? A primary injury, brain injury, occurs at the moment of trauma. A secondary injury from the same trauma is produced by the primary injury and happens as an injury process and takes place over a period of time. The only way to prevent a primary brain injury is to prevent the trauma itself, the car accident, the fall off the ladder, whatever it may be. That's the only way to prevent a primary injury. Secondary injuries from the same trauma is where all the neuroscience is and all the research is right now, because the intensity of the focus of the research is to figure out why the secondary injury process flows from the primary injury and is generally considered to be the most destructive component of a traumatic brain injury. Not so much the primary injury itself, it's the secondary injury processes that take place after the primary injury that causes the significant degree of brain damage. That's why they're referred to as secondary injury, and we're going to talk about, in the mild traumatic brain injury context, what's called excitotoxicity. That is a secondary injury, and it's caused by those broken, twisted, torn, sheared neurons. And I'll explain what is excitotoxicity in greater detail, but another form of secondary injury, again, that comes from the primary injury, is bleeding of the brain, and we know how vascular the brain is, and swelling of the brain. And we know that there's no place for the brain to go when it swells because it's encased in a hard, bony structure. That's a secondary injury. Swelling, bleeding, secondary injury. Shearing of those axon terminals that are white in nature, that's a primary injury. That's what happens at the moment of the trauma. Again, the secondary injury processes that are so powerfully destructive and so unfortunately destructive are occurring sometimes days, weeks, and months after the initial trauma. It takes that long for the secondary injury process to fully come to bear in the human brain. And that's an important thing to realize, because often a person can be injured and they are not feeling great, but they're not feeling particularly injured. They may be a little fuzzy, they may be having some headaches, but what can happen, and I see it all the time, is a secondary injury process begins. It's undetectable, you can't see it on any sort of imaging, and it fulminates. It goes for a period of time, and someone with an incident can weeks later be much worse than they were the week after the incident, because of the nature of a secondary injury process that is occurring. And you recall that the actress Natalie Richardson, I believe her name, and she was in a Natasha, thank you. Then you recall how she passed away. She had a skiing accident and took her to the emergency room. Apparently, she was discharged, no hospitalization, and I think within a week or so after that, she just flat expired. She died. And it's what was going on in that weekend, that period of that week. An excitatory process, excitotoxicity. There was damage to neurons, and that damage was causing a toxic environment, which we'll talk about in a minute, within the rest of her brain. That's surmise on my part, but let me just say that fact pattern fits exactly what something like that would look like, the way she unfortunately passed away. And again, a final secondary injury is blood clots that can cause strokes. There are other secondary injuries, damage to the blood-brain barrier and others, but we'll spend our time focusing on mild traumatic brain injury for now, and I think we're moving on to that with this next slide. This is a slide out of an animation I put together for a client that I was representing. This young lady, unfortunately, was walking through a retail store just shopping for her husband, and on a top shelf was a display frame that weighed about 20 pounds, and it came off the shelf and hit her on the head, and she suffered a mild traumatic brain injury. And by the way, I keep using that term. That's a medical term of art. It's a misnomer. There's nothing mild about mild traumatic brain injury. The symptoms that can be lifelong can be extremely debilitating to a person, and we'll talk about that, but nonetheless, that is the medical term, mild as opposed to moderate or severe. So what happens here, let's review. She had a diffuse axonal injury. She had the shearing of those axons that you see, the gray matter and the white matter, gray and white. And by the way, there's a poster out front with this very same image that you can see close up if you'd like. DIA, that's diffuse axonal injury. That's the medical term for what happens when these neurons that we talked about earlier shear, twist, and break. When there's a traumatic event, what was this traumatic event? Something hit her on the head, forced her head down rapidly, recoiled back. What was happening to her brain when that was occurring? It was slamming up against the front of the structure of the inner side of the brain, where it is hard, bony, and rigid. Then it rebounds back and collides again with the back part of her inner skull. That's what happened to her. And she had the shearing of axons, and we're talking about this in a diffuse context. In other words, it is not focal in nature. It is not localized. Diffuse axonal injury can occur at these junctures of gray and white matter throughout the brain from a trauma. That's why individuals who suffer a mild traumatic brain injury may have a multitude of various and different symptoms that are really reflective of nerve damage in various parts of the brain, because this kind of trauma is not localized to any one spot. I'm talking about diffuse axonal injury. It is diffuse. It is widespread. It is general in nature. Again, this is another example of a normal neuron, brain neuron on the left. You see the connections. You see how the myelin sheath, you see where the axon meets another neuron, and then you see the twisted and damaged nature of the neuron after a rapid acceleration and deceleration process. And I want to mention again, all of this is happening on a microscopic level. I use this as an example in trials just to sort of bring the point home that nerve cells are very much like electric wire. The upper image shows a light bulb connected to a battery. The light is on. You break the line from the battery, the light goes off. That's what a basic brain neuron does as well. If that connection with the axon is healthy and normal, as you see here, and it breaks, the communication from the cell head to another cell is broken. That's where the injury lies. Excitotoxicity. This is the secondary injury process. I want to spend a few minutes on this. Again, excitotoxicity occurs after the primary injury. In mild traumatic brain injury, that diffuse axonal shearing has occurred. Inside the nerves, the brain neuron is the neurotransmitter glutamate. Again, I mentioned earlier that glutamate is vital to normal brain function. You have to have it. Every neuron cell stores glutamate and emits a very small amount of it for a neurotransmission to occur, for there to be communication neuron to neuron, but only a small amount of it. The average nerve cell stores 20 times more glutamate than it uses in a single impulse. Remember, that happens 5 to 50 times every second. It stores 20 times more than it needs. It only emits a small amount. But when the neuron is damaged, what happens? These damaged cells, remember we showed the twisting and tearing, the cells, for some reason, neurons dump all of their glutamate that's stored within it. That creates a toxic environment in extracellular space around the damaged cell. And you may have neurons that were not damaged by the trauma that are otherwise healthy, but they're adjacent to a dying neuron that was sheared. The glutamate dumps into the extracellular space. The glutamate creates a chemical reaction with calcium and other molecules that create a toxic environment. And it's literally called a glutamate storm, and it foments outward from the place where the original neuron was torn, damaged, and extends into otherwise healthy neurons. We talked about how you could be hurt and not feel like the injury was very significant, but days and weeks later, you're having a significant problem. The storm is occurring. That's what is happening within your brain. A secondary injury process is underway. You think you're okay, the primary injury has occurred, you may be functioning okay, but within days or weeks you start feeling worse, you start getting a multitude of various symptoms. Why is that? Because a secondary injury process is underway. And in a mild traumatic brain injury, that's excitotoxicity. And that's excess glutamate dumped by the damaged cell into the cellular space and attacking, for some reason, the healthy cells beside it. Neuroscience does not understand why a damaged brain further damages itself through this dumping of glutamate. Neuroscience hasn't figured that out. They think it's a protective, reactive process that's somehow gone awry. But this is where the serious morbidity is associated with traumatic brain injury. It's excitotoxicity that goes and spreads throughout otherwise healthy brain cells. Mild traumatic brain injury, MTBI, actually has a definition that distinguishes it from severe injury and moderate injury. And this was basically promulgated by the American College of Rehabilitation. It's a working definition for clinicians. When you see a doctor and you're dealing with a head injury, they want to classify you as one of those three. So what is an MTBI, mild traumatic brain injury? Well, clinically, it's symptom-based. If you've had a loss of consciousness or altered loss of consciousness for less than 30 seconds, you're going to fall under MTBI. If it's more than 30 seconds, you're going to be a moderate brain injury or severe brain injury. If you've got a loss of memory of events before or after, not greater than 24 hours, PTA means post-traumatic amnesia. If it's not greater than 24 hours, you fall into the mild category. And then initial Glasgow Coma scale of 13 to 15. We won't spend much time talking about Glasgow Coma scale. It's a clinical assessment of someone immediate post-event orientation, place, time, and thing. Yes?
So is a seizure, is something like that still going to fall under an MTBI, or is it going to be kind of in its own field?
It's kind of it's a symptom. A seizure is a symptom. You can have seizures associated with MTBI. You can have seizures associated with severe and moderate. It's fairly rare to see a seizure associated with a mild traumatic brain injury, but it can happen, and that's a very good question. Does somebody else have a question?
You said seconds, but you wrote minutes. So was it 30 minutes or 30 seconds?
Did I say seconds?
You said seconds.
I'm sorry, 30 minutes. 30 minutes. You know, old school medicine used to think you cannot have a mild traumatic brain injury unless you've lost consciousness. That's just not true anymore. Medical science has advanced beyond that limited thinking. If you have an altered state of consciousness, that can be indicative of a mild traumatic brain injury. You don't have to be knocked out. And for lawyers like me that are representing people trying to prove, look, this person has a traumatic brain injury, the defense attorney says, hey, they weren't knocked out. How could they possibly be hurt? You don't have to be knocked out to have a mild traumatic brain injury, but you do definitionally need an altered state of consciousness. And Dr. Clark talked about some of that this morning if you were here for that earlier session. So that's the technical definition of an MTBI. Here are the symptoms, and they're significant. Headaches, dizziness, memory loss, forgetfulness, personality changes, slowed thought processes, loss of taste and smell, inability to retain and retrieve information. And again, these are symptoms coming from various locations throughout your brain. This is not focal. In other words, it's not isolated to one spot. You've got blurred vision, insomnia, hearing loss, sound sensitivity, tinnitus, that's ringing in the ears. I can honestly say, sadly so, that I have represented clients that have virtually every single one of these symptoms from a mild traumatic brain injury. So that's why mild traumatic brain injury is such a misnomer. Those are serious. Those are disabling. Those are life-altering. Those can affect you for the rest of your life. So there's nothing mild about it. I wanted to just show this slide because there are 4 basic lobes in the brain, and within each lobe there are different functions that are generally being performed. It's kind of difficult to read. I apologize for that. But the brain is, that's a topical map basically. The lobes, it's sort of a topical distinction. This area seems to do this area seems to do that. We know from injuries, quite frankly, what areas of the brain have what functions associated with it. But those are the 4 basic lobes. And I would point out that executive functioning, that's the thinking process, the higher level thinking process that we're all involved in. That comes from the frontal lobe of the brain. And the frontal lobe, of course, is the most involved in a traumatic event. And you think about the frontal lobe, this front of your head. When you fall forward, that's where you're going to damage, automobile accident, all sorts of things. So when you've got an injury to the frontal lobe, oftentimes because of the contracoup effect, and that was discussed earlier, the brain bouncing back and forth, you're going to have also brain damage in this area of the occipital lobe. So anyway, the frontal lobe is where a great deal of executive functioning takes place. Now, these are the challenges of NTBI litigation. And it's a product of something you and I were talking about earlier, and that has to do with the interfacing with the medical community. NTBI litigation, which I'm involved with every day, frankly, is compounded and challenging for a number of reasons. First of all, delaying seeing doctors. A lot of folks think I'm just going to get better, and they don't see a doctor, or they see their family physician. And family physicians are terrific for a lot of things, but they're not really good for diagnosing brain injury. Most of the time they're going to say you'll feel better, take a little this, take a little that, take it easy. And so delaying seeing a doctor is a challenge for lawyers who represent people that have been involved in these sorts of injuries, because there's a gap in treatment. And the individuals who represent the other side of the lawsuits I'm involved in always point to a gap in treatment as saying, hey, this person must have been fine. They didn't see a doctor for 3 months or 6 months. When the opposite is true, but nonetheless, delaying seeing a doctor is a problem. Misdiagnosis, again, the family doctor is terrific, but not at diagnosing this kind of injury. You'd be surprised. I have a great deal of respect for the medical community, but you'd be surprised how many family doctors don't know the things we're talking about right here today. They do not understand mild traumatic brain injury, diffuse axonal injury, excitotoxicity. They simply do not. And it might surprise you. Inconsistent symptom reporting, that's a problem because a person they've got a brain injury. So they're having a hard time remembering problems that they're having and experiencing to even tell their doctor. They're changed, but they don't know exactly how to express that, and that's part of the injury. I think failing to disclose prior medical treatment, that's an issue because often you had a car wreck 20 years ago and you didn't mention that you hit your head in that car wreck. Didn't have anything to do with the lawsuit that I'm involved in and I'm representing you, but it can be an issue. The biggest challenge by far in what I do in representing brain injured people is the negative imaging. That's why I've been emphasizing along the way here the microscopic nature of the structures involved. They are microscopic. You cannot see the axons that are sheared and torn. There's no way to see them. Now, there is some more sophisticated recently technology, MRI technology, but for the general rule, they're microscopic and you can't see them. Here's an example. I'm representing someone who has an MTBI. They get a MRI. On the left, there's the normal MRI. There's the MRI after an MTBI. They're indistinguishable. And what I'll often get is the report from the radiologist group who did the MRI, and it doesn't mention anything other than normal MRI scan. And that's because it's microscopic and you can't see it. Same things happen with CT. CT scans, They're not as sophisticated as MRI scans when it comes to trying to identify microscopic damage. So CTs are a negative always in MTBI cases. So how do we even know that this neuron damage, this diffuse axonal injury that I've been speaking of, how do we even know it exists if you can't see it on CAT scan or can't see it on MRI? We know from autopsies of people that have been involved in this, because then you can examine the brain with a microscope, and there we know what the problem was.
Does that last forever once it's happened? So if you had an autopsy 20 years later, would that still be present?
Yes. Yes, it would. Now we can talk a little bit about plasticity, and that's some of the the rebound nature of the brain and the healing powers of the brain, and but there's even some recent studies that talk about how they've been able to produce some degree of neuron regeneration in mammals, not humans, but there are rat studies and mice studies that show that there's a possibility, that's where the neuroscience is, of actually helping these neurons that have been severed reconnect. That's far from anything therapeutic or beneficial at this time clinically for someone injured, but that's where the science is moving.
When they do that, I guess it's hard to tell within the rats per se, but does that mean a full
Reconnection?
I mean, not just reconnection. Does the processes of which those axons control, do you get full control over those again, or is it a lessened state, some sort of half measure?
Yeah, it's kind of hard. From what I've read, it's difficult to determine because a mouse can't really talk to you.
Yeah.
But the goal is complete reconnection, and the applications are infinitely possible, wonderfully infinite, particularly with paralysis, people that have suffered paralysis. You could regenerate the connected nerves that have been severed. My gosh, what a wonderful thing that would be. But same in the brain. We are far from a place, not right now, where we can regenerate brain cells that have been damaged.
So they're not sure if they're going to regain functionality.
That's exactly right.
That's the starting point.
That's right. And from what I've read, we're years away. But they're excited about what they're seeing in some of these early test results with mice. It's a good question. Oh, these are the things that I try to do, and lawyers who represent clients with MTBI, I try to do immediately, get a client to help overcome the challenges, get to a neurologist. And I'll go so far as to say not just any neurologist. You need to see a neurologist that specializes in closed head injuries and brain damage. Because I've had some neurologists who just do not go there. They're focused on other things. I'd see a neurologist who really does specialize in traumatic events. When you go see a doctor and you're involved in a lawsuit or maybe end up in a lawsuit, you need to take a family member or friend with you to be your spokesperson, to say, let me speak for my husband, or let me speak for my wife. She's doing this, she's doing that. She put the milk in the clothes dryer and rather than the refrigerator. That's not a stretch. Those are exactly the kinds of things that can occur. You get in your car to go someplace and you get halfway there and you don't know where you're going, and then you don't know how to get home. People you've known your whole life, you don't recognize them. You can't follow conversations. You can be watching a TV program and you have no idea what the plot line is. And those are sort of the signs and symptoms of MTBI. I have my clients obtain their own, we get medical records, of course, and I look to see, are they being good historians and telling their doctors their problems? And then I get them to write down, journal these things, diary their events, take it to their doctor so the doctor has it as part of a record. These are the legal issues and challenges associated with MTBI litigation, because I want the medical records to accurately reflect the problems my client is having. Why? Because if they're not recorded in a medical record, I got a defense attorney on the other side of the case saying, well, they must be fine because I don't see any complaints of symptoms. That's why you take a family member with you. That's why you write it down. That's why you hand it to your doctor so it's in your records. And that way you don't have this appearance of being fine and good or healed when that's not the reality of it at all. Get a lawyer early on if you've been involved in an incident, someone who knows this type of work. Not every lawyer is experienced in brain injury cases. They're very complicated. And the lawyer can coordinate the medical care. There are a number of experts that get involved. A lawyer that need to be involved. A lawyer is going to get a neuropsychologist in all likelihood involved at some point. There is sophisticated testing that neuropsychologists can perform that can confirm brain injury and brain damage and disabilities. Notwithstanding the negative MRI, notwithstanding the CT, there are tests that can be done, and they're done by a neuropsychologist that reveals the disabilities and reveals the problems to test results.
So what is the difference between the neurologist and the neuropsychologist?
There's a big difference, and it's a good question. First of all, a neurologist is an MD and can prescribe medicine. A neuropsychologist is a PhD. So that's not a person who can prescribe medicine in a clinical treatment format. But a neuropsychologist, in the context in which I use them, will examine my client, administer a vast array of tests to that client, hours of tests, and then produce a report based on the results of the tests that show deficiencies in the brain here, here, and here. The things that you would like to be able to see in an image, like a CT or an MRI, but they're not sophisticated enough to allow that. You get the same information for persuasion purposes to a jury through a neuropsychologist and the testing of neuropsychological evaluation. Does that make sense?
It does.
Okay. All right, and then lastly, to close out pediatric traumatic brain injuries, there's been a discussion all day on this topic, and I just thought I would close with these final remarks about, as you probably heard throughout the day, it's the leading cause of death and disability in children under 4 years of age, mostly through falls in motor vehicle accidents. And from 4 to 8, introduce the bicycle into their life. You get traumatic brain injuries there. Teenagers, no surprise here, MVA and sports. Actually, boys more than girls suffer pediatric traumatic brain injury. And I think that's just the nature of boys being more rambunctious than girls, but statistically more boys than girls. The structures of the pediatric brain well, the evolving anatomy of a child's brain makes it more susceptible for a number of reasons. It's more watery, for example, makes it the structures more susceptible to injury. Here are some of the differences in the physical characteristics, and some of these make sense, and once you read them, you go, yeah, it kind of makes sense. Bigger head relative to the body, it's a bigger target for injury in a toddler. The head is heavier in a child relative to an adult, so you've got a disproportionate body control issue. Again, it's less dense, more watery, and when the transference of energy, which is what you see when a brain is traveling back and forth in a harmful way inside the skull, you've got different G-forces, same G-forces apply, but you got a different absorption rate for the less dense, the more watery brain of a child than you do an adult. A weaker neck in children. They can't hold their heads up, so they're more apt to be subject to a whiplash type of injury because they simply don't have the neck muscles to support their own heads. And then brain contusions are just statistically more common in the gray area, the gray matter in children. And then brain swelling, the child's brain swells much more quickly than an adult exposed to the same trauma. And things to look for in your children. There's been some great points made earlier. Some of these are right here. You know, toddlers can't tell you what their problems are. Infants certainly can't. Look for these things: changes in attention span, nursing, eating habits, play habits, irritability. All these kind of make sense. Your child is just not behaving the way they used to. And these are some of the things to look for that could reveal that you may not know that your child fell. You may not be around for every little mishap they get into, but these are the things you look for. And lastly, management of pediatric TBI is quite advanced. I've heard from great talks today. One thing I'll close with that is important to know for parents who have children that have suffered a traumatic brain injury, the child often grows into the injury, which is kind of an odd way of saying it, but you suffer an event, a child suffers a head injury, let's say they're 6 years old and they're in the first grade, they recover in the acute phase, they go back to class, they're able to kind of resume some degree of normalcy, they're doing well, and the parents take a deep sigh of relief. Okay, great. But then little Johnny, when he's in the 5th grade, is now calling upon different parts of his brain to do 5th grade work that were not called upon when he was first grader. And all of a sudden, Johnny's grades go down. Johnny struggles academically. Why? Because that injury was there all along, but that part of the brain was not being utilized until he reached a certain level in his educational experience. And oftentimes, parents have a difficult time connecting that dot back to that original injury. But the child literally grows into their injury. And that's something clinicians know well and work with parents on, because it can be quite a shock to a parent and think, what's wrong with Johnny? Well, what's wrong is what happened 4 or 5 years ago. And it's hard to understand that. And then there's tailoring educational programs and counseling for social adjustments. This is all just the basics of what pediatric management for TBI is all about. And that concludes my presentation. I hope that was enlightening.